I would like to introduce Jonah Kolb. He is the president and managing member of Moore and Warner Ag Group in Clinton, Illinois. He leads business development and consulting initiatives for Moore and Warner and working with private and institutional investors to build direct farmland portfolios. He also advises startups, private equity, and venture capital funds pursuing opportunities in production agriculture and agribusiness. His professional experience includes evaluating agricultural big data technology and trends, business development at Cargill, risk management for CF Industries, and consulting in private equity in agriculture and renewable energy. Barely a day goes by without a news release on a new carbon offering, and this breakout in particular will focus on the major developments in carbon programs and the key items to consider while you're preparing or deciding whether or not to enroll your farm in a carbon program. With that being said, please help me virtually welcome Jonah to the 2022 Soybean Summit.
Great, thank you, Megan, and thank you, Randy. I did not know the history of Hasbro, so I appreciate that little tidbit. I will definitely make use of it. Hello, everybody. I'm glad to be joining you remotely. I'm sorry it didn't work to be here in person today. But we're going to get launched in about 35 minutes of content here, and then finish up with some Q&A. So as Megan introduced me, my name is Jonah Kolb. I'm the president of Moore and Warner Ag Group. We're based about 60 minutes east of you in Clinton, Illinois. We manage farmland as professional farm managers across Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, and Colorado. And then we consult on a variety of topics related to production ag. And so the topic today is the state of carbon, which way is up. And if you are in this session, it's probably because it's a topic you're interested in, and there tends to be a fair amount of, I'll call it noise. It's difficult to figure out what we should be paying attention to when it comes to carbon and carbon programs. So our view right now is that carbon and ecosystem markets are a little bit like the Wild West. And staying on top of developments is a little bit like breaking a Bronco, like you see in this Frederick Remington painting. It's just hard to track what's going on and figure out where time and energy should be spent. And if this is the Wild West, something that we've noticed lately is the emergence of what I'll call the carbon cowboy. And Randy, I didn't know you were going to be doing the intro with your cowboy hat there, so that was a fitting plug here. But in our mind, the carbon cowboy is that farm operation that you see featured on the front page of Illinois Ag News or some other industry publication. And it's some farm operation that's making 50 bucks an acre from some carbon or environmental program. And it's enough money that it kind of starts to turn your head and you're asking, what are they up to? Now, if that's the carbon cowboy that we started to see emerging, I want to reinforce that from our perspective, that's probably not the reality. And if I'm going to keep going with this kind of Wild West theme, I'd say the reality is a little bit closer to this. And this is muddling along in a little bit of a dusty wagon train, hoping we're all headed in the right direction, confident that we mostly are, but with a bunch of peers and friends that are looking around wondering, why isn't this carbon stuff moving faster? Are we really sure we're on the right path? And so what I want to do today is say, first of all, it's okay to feel that way and be at this spot. I think this is where most of the industry is. And second of all, we want to add a little bit of structure in today's presentation, just on thinking through where carbon programs are, how to think about them, what resources to rely on, and what questions for a farm operation to ask in looking at carbon and ecosystem market programs. So I'm going to break this talk into 4 relatively quick sections. The first is the global context, what's going on in the background that's driving all of this discussion of carbon. The next is a quick glossary of terms. The next is talking about some programs and really an overview of the resources that are available to compare programs. And then we'll close out with some practical considerations for your farm and thinking about, all right, how do we evaluate programs, where do we prioritize this? So first, the global context for carbon, and I'll cover this somewhat quickly because I think this is a little bit of old hat for folks that are paying attention and plugged in the industry. Carbon is one part of a broader discussion about climate change, sustainability, and the consumer's relationship with food and food production. These conversations are all happening at social, corporate, and governmental levels, and they've been happening for quite some time. As I was doing some research on some carbon issues the other day, I came across some very good work from Iowa State, and I was surprised to see that it was actually about ag markets for carbon, and it was from 2009, and was covering some of the same issues that we're still talking about today as it relates to carbon markets. So these conversations have been happening for a while, and this is happening across this bigger backdrop. You know, this is, in this conversation we're talking about, is what I think of as part of a bigger fundamental shift for agriculture. And in the post-World War II era, we, those of us in production ag, were asked to deliver a cheap and abundant food supply. And from my perspective, my gosh, rural America and the farm sector delivered on that and delivered on that in spades. But today, the ask of the farm sector is changing. And increasingly, agriculture is asked to deliver a set of outputs and a set of outcomes. So what does that mean? That's deliver a corn crop, but with fertilizer efficiency and reducing nutrient runoff. That's deliver bean yields, but incorporate cover crops and no-till that improve soil carbon. And it's this combination that's changing the focus on just efficiency and yield to this broader set of outputs and outcomes. That's part of where carbon and ecosystem services play into this. So I mentioned ecosystem services a couple of times, and I want to pause on that for a minute. You know, carbon or carbon storage, carbon sequestration is really a subset of what's referred to as these ecosystem services. And think about that as a variety of services or things that Mother Nature provides as part of natural systems. So that might be carbon sequestration, pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, maintaining and improving water quality, providing wildlife habitat, maintaining and improving air quality, providing for erosion control, providing for pest control, because natural populations of predators and prey are keeping pests in the right populations. So when we think about ecosystem services, it's sometimes helpful to think about what nature does for free that's either a lot harder or a lot more costly for us to do for ourselves. So an example of that would be the way that swamps and wetlands filter pollutants out of water. They do that in the natural course of just being a swamp or a wetland. If you take that swamp and wetland away, and suddenly we have to put in a wastewater treatment plant to filter out those same pollutants before they get to the ocean, it ends up being very costly and inefficient to build that plant rather than letting the natural ecosystem do its job and provide that water quality ecosystem service. So carbon, it can really be thought of carbon sequestration is one part in this bigger ecosystem services topic. And that's why you'll hear and read and we'll refer to today both carbon programs and carbon markets and also eco markets or ecosystem services markets. The other thing that's happening in this backdrop is that we're building these carbon markets with an uncertain future, excuse me. I was reading a blog piece about carbon in Bloomberg probably 3 weeks ago, and I thought this blog title and then subtitle captured it well. So the title, as you can see here, is Carbon Offset Prices Could Increase 50-fold by 2050. That's great, that got my attention. And then the subtitle, Surging Demand and Unanswered Question on Supply Could Push Offset Prices to Unsustainable Highs or Ill-fated Lows. So in other words, we're not entirely sure how this is going to go. And that's the reality of change. Sometimes we just don't know what the future is going to hold, and all of this is developing and maturing in real time. So that's what that means right now is that carbon and carbon markets are a little messy, but all progress is messy. I love this chart because it captures the idea of progress and change. On the vertical axis, you have improvement or change, and on the horizontal axis, time. And progress is not just a steady upward movement to the right. There's this messy middle that can be confusing. It's taken a couple of steps forward and then a step back, and And it takes some time, and then eventually we come out on the other side and things are different and things are better. And what I'd say right now is that with carbon markets, we're in this messy middle. There's a lot going on. It's hard sometimes to figure out heads or tails, and that's not really all that surprising. Most of the carbon programs that we're talking about in the ag sector today are at most 3 years old, and most are probably 1 or 2 years old. So this is still very early in the development of widespread programs for markets. So that's a background for how I think about where we are today in terms of carbon markets. Next, I want to touch on some key terms before we get into some more specifics, or carbon philosophy. So first, carbon sequestration. That's removing carbon from the atmosphere, where it's a contributor to warming and climate change, and storing that carbon in some other form, liquid or solid, like in the soil, for example. So that's carbon sequestration. Then we have carbon offsets and carbon credits. And these two terms, offset and credit, are used somewhat interchangeably, but they actually have different meanings, at least from a technical standpoint. An offset is removal of carbon from the atmosphere, so taking it out of the atmosphere, whereas a credit is a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So as an example, if you sequester carbon, pulling it out of the atmosphere and putting it in the soil, that would be an offset. But if I decide that, you know what, I'm going to ride my bicycle to work rather than drive my truck, that's a reduction in emissions. I didn't actually pull any carbon out of the atmosphere, I just reduced the emissions from normally driving my truck. A lot of overview articles and some of the resources that I'm going to point you to later today actually mix and match these terms, and in general that's okay. You kind of get the general concept here. A carbon inset is a little bit different. Whereas carbon offsets and credits are generally the idea that, let's say we're taking the farming side as an example, we're going to do something here in our row crop farming that generates a carbon credit, so we're pulling carbon usually out of the atmosphere and putting it into our soil, and then we're going to sell that credit to some other industry, oil and gas, the auto industry, manufacturing is trying to offset their carbon footprint. That's the trade that's happening. It's many times cross-industry. A carbon inset is the idea that we're trying to improve the greenhouse gas emissions and the carbon footprint of our own industry, of our own ag supply chain. So a carbon inset within our supply chain might be, hey, we're farming more efficiently, and that allows an ethanol producer or a food processor to say, hey, the carbon footprint from farm all the way to my product is actually a little bit more efficient, or it has improved. That's an inset. It's a little bit different. They're not traded in the same way or priced in the same way that offsets and credits are. And offsets and credits are really what we're talking about today. The other piece that is going to come up in terms of talking about these programs and markets is this idea of additionality and this idea of permanence. Additionality is the idea that you generate a carbon or ecosystem credit by doing something that is different or additional than you would do in the absence of a program. So in other words, you don't get credit for the status quo. You've got to do something different. This is a tough one, especially depending on a carbon program. So if you've been no-till for a number of years, or you've been cover cropping for a number of years, there are a number of carbon programs that will say, you know what, you come to the program, you're not doing something different by those practices, and therefore you don't get any credit for it. Even though you're enrolling in the program, you've been doing it for the last 10 years. So the idea of additionality is doing something new or different that's changing or sequestering carbon. Permanence is really about the length of time that that carbon is sequestered. So if you sequester carbon into the soil by no-till or cover cropping, a combination of the two, and then you go back to conventional tillage a year or two later, the carbon that was stored is re-released in the atmosphere. It's not permanent. And so when we see permanence, it's this idea that the carbon is sequestered on a long-term basis. Permanent may not mean for forever, but it does mean on a long-term basis. And you should expect, and we'll get to this later, that different programs actually define additionality and permanence a little bit separately. And that's something to evaluate in looking at carbon programs and ecosystem markets. The last thing I want to touch on in this slide before moving on is the idea of voluntary markets. When we're talking about carbon programs and ecosystem markets today, they are voluntary. As of today, there is no governmental ag carbon credit standard when it comes to farming or many other industries. There's not a cap and trade system. This isn't a level of regulation like there are around certain other pollutants. And that's part of the reason that it's a little bit confusing right now about what's going on and why there are different carbon markets, is that carbon markets are defining slightly different credits and offsets for buyers that have different preferences. And I'll come back to that in a minute, but keep in mind this idea of voluntary markets. These are farmers, if we're talking about production ag, voluntarily enrolling in a carbon program to produce credits that in most cases the buyers, companies wanting to offset their carbon footprint, are voluntarily purchasing. The basic premise, which I just described, is step one, we go out and farm. We engage in a set of activities or deliver a set of verifiable outcomes that show that, hey, we're sequestering carbon as part of our farming practices. As a result of step two, we generate a credit or offset from those above activities. And step three is we sell it to someone or we have someone sell it for us. So who's buying these credits? It's a good question. There are all sorts of companies. So everybody from Microsoft to a microbrew beer company that's interested in reducing their carbon footprints, getting it carbon neutral, that want to advertise to their customers that they're carbon responsible, are buying offsets. And what I described in step one, there are different ways to generate offsets, that really comes down to carbon buyers and carbon programs. Because there's no individual standard, there are a variety of ways of doing carbon accounting, carbon modeling, and carbon testing associated with these credits. So right now, in these voluntary markets that I described, the big buyers, like Microsoft as an example, is actually vetting the protocols and standards, and in some cases, the science behind a carbon program. Let's take Indigo as an example, is deciding, hey, do we agree with the way that they're doing their carbon accounting, the way that they're tracking and generating credits, the way that they're auditing on-farm practices. And if they agree, feel good about it, then maybe they buy credits through that marketplace. But if they don't, they may look to go to another market or another source of carbon credits. So there's this interesting dynamic right now where there's a quality component and a level of discretion on behalf of buyers and markets of what they're actually doing to generate these offsets and credits. So those are our basic glossary terms. Next, I want to step into a quick overview of programs and resources. And if I come back to my analogy, and forgive me for beating this to death, of the Wild West, I would say that today, thankfully, after a couple of years, the sheriff is finally arriving. And in this photo, this is Wyatt Earp and his brothers from the movie Tombstone, where they're bringing some law and order to the city of Tombstone. And I would argue in the last 12 months, we've finally seen a little bit of organization within what's going on in carbon markets as the industry starts to analyze and classify carbon programs. And I think that's because there's an increasing urgency around carbon and climate change, at least within governmental and corporate sectors. And there's a lot of money coming into program development and carbon markets. And it feels to me at least like a variety of ag organizations have finally said, hey, you know what? This is really important. These trends are not going away. It's an opportunity for ag to be a positive part of the solution rather than the bad guy. And we've got to figure out how to make this entire topic more approachable for our farmers. So there are some great resources that have come online really within the last 12 or 13 months. And these are coming from extension, checkoff, and conservation organizations that are covering the topic. And I want to highlight three that I think are doing a really good job. The first is the Illinois Sustainable Ag Partnership. So this is a collaboration between a number of organizations that include the Illinois Chicken Association, Illinois Corn Growers, American Farmland Trust, who I think presented earlier today, Nature Conservancy, Soil and Water Conservation Districts, and a number of others. And they've produced a great document that you can find off this link called the Eco Markets Program Comparison. And I'm actually going to pull a table from that report on the next slide. So that's one resource. The next is Iowa State University Extension. I want to give our friends over in Iowa some credit. They have a couple of fantastic explainer pieces on what's going on in carbon. The first is how to grow and sell carbon credits in U.S. agriculture. And that includes some general education material and then a program comparison. And then they also have another report, how do data and payments flow through ag carbon programs. And that's an even more in-depth piece that actually flow charts who's doing what and how they're getting paid in various carbon programs. And I think it's a really good resource that I'll highlight and I'll show you in the next slide here. And then you also have, we're here, our very own Illinois Soybean Association and the Illinois Soy Advisor website, which already has a section on carbon resources, and we'll be getting a new carbon section on a new website, or a page on the website section that will be launched later this spring. So if you're curious, there's a lot out there, and I would say it's improving, maybe not daily, but certainly by the season. So this time-saving insight analysis that I mentioned, this is the Eco Markets Program comparison for the Illinois Sustainable Ag Partnership. It details 10 different carbon programs by a variety of different metrics. And if you can read the small print over on the left, it's things like acreage minimum and maximum, contract length, new practice requirements, what the practice requirements include things like what the additionality requirements, what do you have to do, a payment schedule, an ability to enroll multiple fields or multiple farms in a program. Sometimes you'll see that referred to as stacking. How outcomes are estimated. How is the carbon credit estimated or generated? Are there third-party practice verification audits that happen on farm or in the program to determine if things are happening the way they should be? And the list of metrics goes on. This is a really helpful snapshot to compare carbon and ecosystem programs and outreach. Who's doing what across the board. These are great funding and university dollars that are going into this kind of work right now. And again, I've got the link to pull this up if it's interesting to you. And I think that this slide deck will be provided after today's session. So the next page, this is from Iowa State University Extension, and actually goes a step further. So this is the flow chart that describes who's doing what and who's paying what for various carbon programs. These flow charts are really interesting depending on how much detail you want to get into. But one thing that I'll highlight is that the first time I was reading through these reports, my reaction was, well, there are a lot of people and a lot of costs that need to be paid out of carbon credits. And all the green arrows on here are the payments. That's probably part of the reason that we're not seeing higher per acre payments to farmers as part of the programs today. We're just trying to stretch a dollar across a variety of different players. So in this overview work, and that's really the place to get the best detail on what's going on in Indigo's carbon program or the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund, and what's happening in Nori's marketplace. I'll point you to these resources, but in a high level, there's really 3 emerging program categories and probably 10 or 11 different programs and pilot programs that are out there today. And these are the 3 program categories. So first you have carbon and ecosystem markets. ESMC and the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund are both broader than just carbon, include things like water quality. Indigo and Nori focus just on carbon today. But that's category 1. Category 2 would be input providers. So just as you'd expect, these are some of the majors that have these outcome and carbon program offerings. You have Bayer and Corteva just like you'd expect. And then there are data platforms, and those include SIBO, FBN, Farmers Business Network, Truterra. I think, in my view, the difference between the data platforms and the marketplaces are not entirely clear, maybe other than a fine distinction between the data platforms really focus on and build from the data side, and that leads, rather than from the carbon offering itself. But this is probably the categorization that you'll see if you're reading any article about what's going on in the space. And the names on here are these 10 or 11 programs that are really out there with offerings today. So this is where we come to the, okay, now what? we've got categories of programs. This is all pretty new. We can identify and read the program comparisons, but what do we make of it? And how do we turn this into something that is useful for a given farm organization or a farm operation? And so I want to focus on what I think of as kind of 8 practical considerations when it comes to evaluating carbon programs today and where they fit within a given farm operation. And these are the 8. So number 1, adoption timing. When do you start? Number 2, program duration. How long a contract are you signing? Number 3, program model. Of the 3 program categories that I just described, is one of them most appealing? And number 4, land base. What farmland do you own versus rent, and what does that ground actually look like? Number 5, current farming practices. Are you already doing or already knowledgeable about some of the practices that these programs require? No-till, cover cropping, changing your fertility program, for example. Number 6, data and data rights. How much of your existing operational farm data is organized and digitized? How much do you care about farm data privacy? That really varies from farm operation to farm operation. Number 7, economics. These programs and practices take time. What's your personal ROI for it to be worth the headache of going down this path? And number 8, fine print. Program agreements and contracts are not something to click through the way that we all click through the pesky software licensing agreements every time you download an app. These are much more involved and they have long-term consequences. So I want to spend a few minutes here focused on each of these 8 considerations when we're looking at these programs. So number 1, on adoption timing, or when we decide to enroll. What's your patience level for new and evolving programs? As I mentioned, these are all pretty new. Indigo is one of the oldest, and they launched in 2019. What's your risk appetite when you're looking at something new? Programs differ in their economic incentives, and the question I ask is, if you're looking at a long-term program with a fixed or semi-fixed payment of carbon credit, is that okay? Would you price all of your 2032 soybean crop today? Yeah, probably not. So you probably don't want to price and lock in all of your carbon for the next 10 years either. On the bottom of this slide, you see an adoption curve that may look familiar. It's basically this idea that shows the different sizes of the segments of adopters, from innovators and early adopters to the early majority, late majority, and laggards, right? There are these big chunks of lots of people in the early and late majority, fewer people as innovators, and fewer people as laggards. And this scholar, Jeffrey Moore, came up with this idea of the chasm or gap that you see here. And it's the idea that when you look at a new innovation and its adoption, you get innovators and you get early adopters, but then there's this gulf, this delay, this chasm, before you get to the early majority of adopters. And right now, I would say that we are somewhere in the innovators and early adopters of carbon programs in ecosystem markets. And there is going to be, we're probably not even quite there yet, this chasm as a variety of issues get worked out. And those issues are things like data rights, economics. Are the payments enough for the practices involved? In dealing with thorny issues like farming on rented ground. Who gets paid when you sign a 10-year carbon program on leased ground, but the underlying lease is a year-to-year lease on a cash rent? Those are kind of thorny topics that we haven't entirely worked out yet, and that are going to need to get a little bit finer tuned before we get into the majority of ag land coming into these programs. But I want to make clear, my view is that within the next 10 years, we're going to cross over these hurdles, and we're going to see a majority of acreage involved in these programs. There is enough demand, and there are real economics to drive. So that's adoption timing. Second consideration here is program duration. Are you willing to do a 1, 5, 10-year agreement? There's a range of what's out there. And related to that is, what's the strength of the program offering or carbon partner? Ag carbon is so new that we haven't seen a market or marketplace go bankrupt, fold, close down, or be acquired yet, but that's going to happen. And if we think about a 10-year contract, the question is, what happens? Is there someone else that will pick that up? If not, what does that mean for a payment schedule or an ability to roll a carbon credit to a new program? 3 program models and the program categories that I talked about a minute ago. Do you want to be in a marketplace where you're relying on the market to source the highest bidding buyer? Do you prefer to sell to an input provider who might already have all of your farm data as part of their agronomic services? Or do you think of carbon as part of your independent farm data play? Here on the right, I asked the question, who is your carbon czar? So that's the person you're going to rely on as the expert to navigate program evaluation, enrollment, and compliance. Is that you as a primary farmer operator? Is that an employee? Is that a hired hand? Might be an independent agronomist or an ag retail relationship. There are a lot of moving pieces to stay on top of here, and I like to remind folks that we have 3 people in an organization and all of them are half up to speed on a given topic. Nobody is actually up to speed. Everybody's only half. You don't get to add those 3 halves together and somehow get to a full understanding of a complicated issue. So the 4th item here is land base. What are your owned and rented acres? I already mentioned long-term tenancy on rented ground is a thorny issue. How do we split payments between a farmer and a landowner? The farmer is doing the work of carbon sequestration, but the landowner owns the asset, the soil in which it's stored. And I've yet to see an elegant solution to this problem, but it's a known factor that certainly academics have been talking about probably 10 to 15 years when it comes to ag and the development of carbon markets. The other question is a question of fit for actual farm. What farms, what fields are right for a carbon program? There may be fields where you need maximum production flexibility for tillage and fertility that you don't want to limit by the practice requirements of a carbon program. And on the other hand, there may be fields that are really well suited to no-till or cover cropping or change in fertility program that's going to help qualify for higher and higher payments. So thinking about the actual lay of the land, so to speak, makes a difference in evaluating different programs. Number 5 is current farming practices. We talked earlier about additionality, so my question for any given farming operation is, where are you going to have to learn and change? How do you feel about that? Is it tillage? Is it moving away from fall-applied nitrogen? Is it cover cropping? Changing a lot of variables at once can be a big logistical and operational change for a farm. So how do you think about staging the learning of new practices and how you execute them so it's not everything all at once? Look for programs that don't have stringent additionality requirements. If you've been doing no-till for 10 years, you want to get some credit for it if you can, even though going to no-till might not be a new practice for you. And that's where the program evaluation and the comparisons that I pointed to earlier can be a big help. So number 6, data. On-farm data, where are you? In carbon ecosystem markets, no data means no dollars. I feel like we've been talking a lot about digital farm data for at least the last 10 years, and it seems like getting paid for that data has always been just out of reach. But with these ecosystem and carbon markets, data and records are really the ticket to entry and the ticket to payment. So my first question is the data house in order? Are you collecting good machine data for every pass across the field? Are you collecting application rates and product codes? Even farmers that we work with that I'd say have typically great data are frequently lacking good data on tillage and tillage passes. So that's something that I think could be a little bit of a blind spot right now. Next question is, how important are data rights, and what are you potentially signing away as part of these programs? I caution farm operators to be aware of what I call the data backdoor. And as I've read through some program details, I'm concerned about the data backdoor, which is when what you want to do is sell your carbon credits from engaging in certain practices on your farm. But what you do is sell your carbon credits, and then you sign away the rights to all of the data that you provided related to the practices for the carbon program. And so that becomes this, oops, I didn't need to do that. If you believe, and I'm not saying this is right or wrong, but let's say that you believe your farm data is worth $10 or $15 an acre. If that's the case and you think that's the value of your organized farm data, you shouldn't sign up for a carbon and ecosystem market program that pays you $10 or $15 an acre, but can do whatever it wants with the data that you provide for your practices verification. Those should be two different monetization streams. One for your carbon practices, one for your data. And programs have different language, different terms of use as regards to what they're going to do with the data that's provided and collected. And maybe the last consideration on data that's not bulleted here is thinking about what sort of program, what sort of offers a program is making in terms of data management, historical data upload, and how much a program and its administrators can pre-fill things like crop history based on good historical records from satellite imagery. It just has the potential to be a major time and headache saver if there are resources to help and you don't have to get everything organized and uploaded entirely on your own time and on your own dime. So the next up on number 7, considerations, is economics. And my question is, what is that additionality and permanence that you described worth it to you in terms of dollars? And when will the carbon offset and credit market get there if you're not compelled by the prices that are being offered today? If you can set that price, so let's say, for example, you take a look at those resources I mentioned and figure out, you know what, the best case scenario, I can get $20 an acre in these programs today. If you can look at that and say, for my operation, I think we probably need 30 to 40 for this to make sense, it's going to save you a lot of time monitoring program development, because then you're looking at one metric roughly in terms of evaluating programs. I like this chart. It was from Bloomberg earlier this month because it captures some of the we don't know about the carbon market. And this is 3 different scenarios on what might happen to carbon offset prices from where we are today, which is about $2 to $3 a ton. The removal scenario in blue is the highest and fastest, and that's basically where governments mandate a certain amount of carbon offsetting, carbon removal. And on the other end of the spectrum is the voluntary market scenario, which is what we do have today. Voluntary buyers trying to source good quality credits to offset their carbon footprints. And that's likely a much slower and long-term uptick in both demand and the value of offsets. So if we have this much uncertainty in terms of carbon markets, that probably translates into looking at programs where you feel confident you're in a position to benefit from the upside if there are changes in policy or big moves in the value of carbon offsets. Today, we just don't know what the final offset prices are going to be in 10, 20, 30 years. And then my last practical consideration here is paying attention to the fine print. This little bit about Indigo's carbon program caught my attention. New or expanded tile drainage will disqualify a field enrolled in Indigo's carbon program. That might not be an issue, but you just want to know that going in. This stuff starts to get complicated when we think about additionality. If you don't want to enroll in this, or if you do want to enroll in this Indigo carbon program and make your practice changes, but 3 years later you want to change drainage and you get kicked out, you're not going to be able to enroll in a new program that has an additionality requirement. You already did your practice changes 3 years prior. So these decisions and thinking and evaluation are later, and the fine print is important. So with that, I want to close and offer this picture. It's probably a poorly chosen photo because we're talking about carbon, and this locomotive is kicking out a bunch of smoke. But a farmer that I enjoyed working with over the years described change in the following way. New innovations pick up speed over time, like a train leaving a station, and the longer you wait to get on, the harder and harder it is to catch up and pull yourself on board. And so carbon markets today might be in that messy middle that I described, but I would argue it's time to dip a toe, try some practice changes in a field or two, get comfortable with the way these programs are set up, that you don't feel like you're getting left behind and you're on the platform a couple of years from now when things are up and moving in speed. So with that, I'm going to put up the CEU credit and then ask Megan if there are any questions.